The wind had teeth, and it was biting at Caleb's back through his worn sheepskin coat. It was a hungry wind, the kind that came ahead of a real storm, smelling of ice and trouble from 100 miles north. The sky, once a vast, indifferent blue over the Wyoming territory, was now the color of a fresh bruise, darkening from the horizon inward. Caleb urged his horse, Gideon, into a steadier trot. The animal didn't need the encouragement. He could feel the pressure dropping in the air, the electric charge that promised a world buried in white. Caleb was a man carved from the land itself. At 34, his face was a map of long days under a merciless sun and too many nights sleeping under the stars. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, had seen the tail end of the war and the bottom of more whiskey bottles than he cared to count. But that was a lifetime ago. For the last 10 years, his world had been this: the sweeping plains, the distant, jagged teeth of the Bighorn Mountains, and the solitary patch of earth he called a ranch. It was a life of quiet, of routine, a fortress of solitude he had built around a heart he preferred to keep undisturbed. Trouble was a foreign language he had no desire to relearn. He'd been in Rock Creek for supplies, and the talk in the general store was all about the coming blizzard. Worst one in a decade. Old Mr. Abernathy had said, stroking his white beard as he weighed out a sack of flour. "You best be holed up tight, Caleb. This ain't no squall." Caleb had only nodded, his words as sparse as the trees on his land. He'd bought what he needed: flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges, strapped it to his pack horse, and turned for home without another word. He liked the quiet. He trusted it. People, on the other hand, were like sudden storms, unpredictable and often destructive. The wind howled a low, mournful tune through the sagebrush, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, small, hard pellets that stung his cheeks. He was still a good 5 miles from the familiar cottonwoods that marked his property line when he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape against the graying landscape, a jagged anomaly in the smooth, rolling emptiness. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the skeletal ruin of a prairie schooner. It was wrecked, and badly. One wheel was completely splintered, the axle broken clean through. The canvas top was ripped to shreds, flapping like a wounded bird in the rising gale. It looked as if it had been tossed by a giant's hand and left to rot. A common enough sight out here, a testament to broken dreams and poor planning. His first instinct was to ride on. It was none of his business. The storm was coming, and he had livestock to see to. But then, a flicker of movement from within the wreckage caught his eye. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A small, pale shape, cursing under his breath. Caleb pulled Gideon to a halt. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going. Strangers meant questions, needs, complications. They were anchors in the open sea of his solitude. Yet, the memory of other bodies, left behind on frozen battlefields, pricked at a conscience he thought long dead. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The wind ripped at his hat, and he pulled it down low. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. There was no answer, only the shriek of the wind and the frantic flapping of the canvas. He approached the wagon cautiously, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Robbers sometimes used wrecks as traps. He peered into the shadowed interior, and his breath caught in his throat. Huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a single, threadbare blanket, were a woman and a young boy. The boy, no older than 7 or 8, was pressed against her side, his small body trembling violently. The woman had her arm wrapped tightly around him, her own shivers running through her like a current. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were wide and dark, filled with a fear so deep it was almost silent. In the dim light, he could see she was young, maybe 25. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and a dark bruise was forming high on her cheekbone. She was beautiful, in the way a porcelain doll left out in the rain is beautiful, delicate, misplaced, and on the verge of shattering. "Ma'am," Caleb said, his voice softer than he intended. The woman flinched, pulling the boy closer. Her eyes darted from Caleb to the gun on his hip and back again. She didn't speak. "The storm," Caleb said, pointing vaguely toward the bruised sky. "It's gonna be a bad one. You can't stay here." The boy whimpered, a small, pathetic sound that was nearly swallowed by the wind. The woman's gaze flickered down to him, her expression a mixture of fierce protection and utter despair. We have nowhere to go," she finally whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Our horse bolted. They took everything." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. Caleb's eyes scanned the area. Tracks were already being erased by the snow, but he could see the signs of a struggle, a broken crate, scattered belongings, the deep ruts of horses ridden hard. His jaw tightened. He didn't want this. He didn't want any part of this. Taking them in meant bringing their trouble home with him. It meant noise where there was silence, needs where there was self-sufficiency. But leaving them here was a death sentence. The blizzard would show no mercy. He looked at the boy's small, pale face, and the decision was made for him, against his will. "My ranch is 5 miles east," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "It's not much, but it's warm. Can you ride?" The woman nodded weakly, trying to push herself up. She swayed, and would have fallen if not for the side of the wagon. She was weaker than she looked. "And the boy?" "Samuel," she breathed. "His name is Samuel. He can ride with me." Caleb shook his head. "You can barely stand. He'll ride with me." He turned to Gideon, who had stood patiently through it all. This was going to be a long, slow ride, with a sigh that seemed to pull from the depths of his soul. He untied his bedroll and an extra blanket. "Here," he said, handing her the thicker blanket. "Wrap this around you." He moved to the boy, who shrank back. Caleb knelt, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Come on, son. Let's get you out of this wind." He scooped the boy up. He was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of bones and fear. Caleb swung him up into Gideon's saddle, then mounted behind him, settling the boy securely in front of him. He wrapped the edges of his own coat around the small, trembling frame. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, had managed to get to her feet. She climbed onto the pack horse with a pained grimace, clutching the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, his voice rough against the wind. "Eliza," she said, her teeth chattering. "Eliza Mayhew." "Caleb," he grunted in return. He didn't offer a last name. It wasn't necessary. He clicked his tongue, and Gideon, burdened with his new passenger, began the slow walk home, leaving the broken wagon to be consumed by the storm. The ranch was not much more than a sturdy cabin, a barn, and a corral, all built by Caleb's own hands from pine he'd felled himself. It was a place of function, not comfort. The inside of the cabin was much the same, a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft, and a single door led to a small, private bedroom he'd added on last spring. It was clean, sparse, and intensely personal. The presence of strangers felt like a violation. He settled them in the main room, stoking the embers in the fireplace until a healthy blaze roared to life, chasing the chill from the air. He left them there, huddled by the hearth, and went to see to the horses and livestock, his movements mechanical and efficient. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, the world outside turning into a swirling vortex of white. By the time he returned, soaked and cold, he could barely see the barn from the cabin door. Eliza had found a pot and was attempting to heat some water over the fire. Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. Samuel was asleep on the hearthrug, a deep exhaustion etched on his young face. Caleb took the pot from her without a word and filled it with water from the pump barrel. He set it on the hook over the flames and then spooned coffee grounds into the percolator basket. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. "I am grateful, Mr. Caleb," Eliza said quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "You saved our lives." "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't true. Many would have ridden right on by. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her. She took it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. "My husband passed a year ago," she began, as if feeling the need to explain herself, to fill the heavy silence with a story that might make sense of her predicament. "I was taking Samuel to my sister in Montana. We were making for Fort Laramie when we took a wrong turn. Then, those men, they came out of nowhere." Her voice trembled, and she stopped, taking a shaky sip of coffee. Caleb didn't press for details. He could fill in the blanks himself. The West was full of men who preyed on the weak, who saw a lone woman as an opportunity. He felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut, an anger he had learned long ago to bury deep. "You'll be safe here," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He wasn't in the business of offering safety, at least until the storm passes. He gave them his bedroom for the night. It was the only room with a proper door. He laid out fresh linens on the bed, a simple act of hospitality that felt strangely intimate. He would take the loft. "Thank you," Eliza whispered as she guided a drowsy Samuel into the room. Her eyes met his for a moment, and in their dark depths, he saw a universe of pain, fear, and a weariness that went bone deep. He saw something else, too, a flicker of resilience, a spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. He quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the connection. He made his bed in the loft, a simple pallet of blankets. The storm raged outside, a living thing, shaking the sturdy cabin to its foundations. Sleep did not come easily. His well-ordered world had been thrown into chaos. He thought of the woman in his bed, a stranger with a bruised face and haunted eyes. He thought of the trouble she might bring. He was a fool, a damn fool for bringing her here. Then, through the roar of the wind, he heard it. It was a faint sound, coming from the room below. At first, he thought it was the house groaning under the weight of the snow, but it came again, soft and rhythmic. It was the sound of someone crying, not a loud wail, but a quiet, broken sound, the kind of grief that has no hope of being answered. It was the sound of a soul breaking in the dark. Caleb lay perfectly still, listening. He pictured her in his bed, curled up in the darkness, trying to muffle her sobs so as not to wake her brother, so as not to be heard by the stranger who had saved her. Every instinct told him to stay put, to ignore it. It was her pain, not his. But the sound slipped through the cracks in his armor, finding a place deep inside him that ached in sympathy. The hardness in his heart, the carefully constructed wall he had spent a decade building, faltered, for the first time in a very long time. Caleb felt a pang of something other than his own quiet loneliness. It was a chink in the ice, a thawing he hadn't asked for and didn't want. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he could not shut out the sound of her tears. The next morning, the world was gone. Caleb awoke to an eerie silence. The wind had not died, but its howl was muffled, muted. He climbed down from the loft and looked at the single window in the main room. It was completely dark. He opened the cabin door a crack and was met with a solid wall of white. Snow was drifted clear up past the eaves. The world outside had vanished, leaving only the three of them and the muted roar of the blizzard. They were trapped. For how long? Only God and the storm knew. And in that silent, buried cabin, a new kind of storm was just beginning to gather. The days that followed were measured not by the sun, which had ceased to exist, but by the slow burning of logs in the hearth and the rising and falling of the wind's lament. The world was a womb of white, silent and suffocating. On the first morning, Caleb spent 3 hours with a shovel, digging a narrow trench from the cabin door to the barn. It was like carving a tunnel through a solid mountain. The snow was heavy and wet, and the wind filled the passage almost as fast as he could clear it. Inside, the muffled sounds of his labor were the only proof that an outside world still existed. When he finally stumbled back in, covered in a crust of ice, he found Eliza had been busy. She had found his meager supply of potatoes and onions and was making a thin stew. Samuel sat at the rough-hewn table, tracing patterns in a dusting of flour, his eyes wide and watchful. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke and, for the first time, something akin to food being cooked with care. A silent rhythm established itself, born of necessity. Each morning, Caleb would make the perilous journey to the barn to feed and water the livestock. His 2 milk cows, the sturdy oxen, and the horses were his livelihood, and their survival was paramount. Eliza would have coffee boiling on the hearth when he returned, his beard and eyebrows caked with ice. They ate their meals in near silence, the space between them filled with the storm's roar. Afternoons were for chores. Caleb showed Eliza how to work the butter churn. Her movements were clumsy at first, her city-bred hands unused to the repetitive labor. But she learned quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he sat cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil mingling with the smell of churning cream. He saw the way she patiently answered Samuel's endless questions, the way her hands, though chapped and red from the cold, were always gentle with the boy. She never complained. She never asked for anything. She simply did what needed to be done, her presence a quiet, steady hum in the thunderous silence of his life. The landscape outside was a masterpiece of savage beauty. The wind scoured the drifts into fantastic shapes, like waves on a frozen ocean. The tops of his tallest pines were bent low, heavy with their burden of snow, their branches groaning in the gale. Some nights, when the wind died down for an hour or two, a new sound would rise from the plains, the lonely, chilling howl of a wolf pack. The first time they heard it, Samuel scrambled into Eliza's lap, his small body rigid with fear. Eliza held him tight, her own knuckles white where she gripped his shoulder, her eyes darting toward the snow-choked window. Caleb, seeing her fear, got up and threw another heavy log on the fire. The flames leaped high, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "They won't come near the cabin," he said, his voice a low rumble, too afraid of the fire. It was a small comfort, but he saw her shoulders relax a fraction. It was in these small moments that the walls between them began to show cracks. One evening, as she was mending a tear in one of Samuel's shirts by the firelight, she began to talk. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the wind. "My husband, Arthur," she started, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "He was a merchant back east, a man of some standing." Caleb didn't respond, just kept sharpening a skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a steady counterpoint to her words. He had learned that silence was the best invitation for a person to keep talking. "He had a temper," she continued, her eyes fixed on her sewing. He said a wife's duty was to be obedient, to be available for her husband's needs, no matter her own feelings." She chose her words carefully, but the meaning was as clear as a shard of ice. Caleb's hand stilled on the whetstone. He looked at the fire, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He had known men like Arthur, men who saw strength as a weapon and women as property. When his business failed, he turned to the bottle. It only made him meaner. The beatings became more frequent. She took a shaky breath, and for a moment, he thought she would stop. But she went on, as if lancing a wound that had festered for too long. "He never touched Samuel, though I made sure of that. I always put myself between them. I learned how to take a blow without crying out. Crying only made him angrier." She looked up then, and her eyes met his across the flickering firelight. There was no plea for pity in them, only a stark, harrowing honesty. He saw the ghost of the bruises he had seen on her cheek, and he imagined 100 others, hidden beneath her dress, faded but not forgotten. He saw a courage that shamed him, a resilience forged in a private hell he could barely imagine. He, who had faced cannon fire and the raw violence of men at war, knew that her kind of bravery was quieter but no less profound. "He died in his sleep," she finished, her voice flat. "The doctor called it a weak heart. The whiskey called it victory." She folded the mended shirt and set it aside. Her story finished. Caleb cleared his throat. "You're a strong woman, Eliza." The words were simple, gruff, and utterly inadequate. But they were more than he had said to anyone in years. A faint blush colored her pale cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, hiding them in her lap. From then on, the silence between them was different. It was less a void and more a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. He started leaving a bucket of fresh, warm milk by the door for her and Samuel each morning. She started mending his clothes, patching a worn elbow on his coat, sewing a button back on his shirt. Small domestic acts that felt both foreign and strangely comforting. He saw her watching him, her gaze curious and cautious. She saw a man who moved with a quiet economy, who spoke little but whose actions were always deliberate and, to her surprise, gentle. He never raised his voice. He never slammed a door. When he handed her a cup or a plate, his rough, calloused fingers were careful not to brush against hers. For a woman whose experience of men was one of pain and violation, this simple respect was a revelation. It was a balm on a wound she didn't know was still bleeding. The storm showed no sign of letting up. On the 5th night, the temperature plummeted even further. The cabin groaned, and a fine powder of snow sifted through invisible cracks in the walls. Caleb was checking a new leak in the roof near the loft when he heard Samuel's panicked voice. "Mama, Mama, wake up!" He climbed down the ladder quickly. Eliza was still on her cot, which she'd insisted on setting up in the main room so Samuel could have the bed in the private room. The boy was shaking her shoulder, his face pale with worry. "She's hot, Caleb," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "Real hot." Caleb knelt beside the cot. He placed the back of his hand on her forehead. The heat that radiated from her skin was alarming. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her eyes were closed, but she was restless, her head moving back and forth on the pillow. Fever. A bad one. Out here, with no doctor and no medicine, a fever could be a death sentence. A cold fear, unfamiliar and unwelcome, gripped him. "Samuel," he said, his voice steady and calm, masking his own anxiety. "I need you to be a brave boy for me. Go into the bedroom and stay there. I'll take care of your mother." The boy looked from Caleb to his mother, his lower lip trembling, but he nodded and did as he was told, closing the door softly behind him. Caleb sprang into action. He filled a basin with snow from the barrel just inside the door, letting it melt into icy water. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack and dipped it in the water, wringing it out before gently placing it on Eliza's forehead. She moaned, a soft, incoherent sound, but she didn't pull away. For the rest of the night, he sat by her side, a silent sentinel in the flickering firelight. The storm outside seemed to redouble its fury, as if trying to break through the walls and claim the life within. He changed the cloths on her forehead and her wrists, his large, rough hands moving with a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He coaxed spoonfuls of water between her parched lips. In her delirium, she murmured broken phrases, names he didn't know, pleased to be left alone. "Once," she cried out, "No, Arthur, please," and tried to shrink away from his touch. "It's all right, Eliza," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's just me. It's Caleb. You're safe." He didn't know if she could hear him, but he kept talking, his voice a low, soothing anchor in the sea of her fevered dreams. He told her about his land, about the way the sun looked rising over the mountains in the spring. He told her about his horse, Gideon, and how he'd raised him from a colt. He spoke more in that one night than he had in the past year, filling the small, warm cabin with the quiet truths of his solitary life. He was tending not just to her body, but to her spirit, trying to call her back from the dark places her fever had taken her. He was fighting the storm, both outside and in. Toward dawn, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, the fever broke. The violent shivering stopped, replaced by a sheen of sweat on her skin. Her breathing deepened, becoming even and regular. She was sleeping peacefully, exhausted. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, relief washing over him in a wave so powerful it left him weak. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, the light in the cabin had changed. A pale gray light was filtering through a small patch of the window he had cleared. He looked over at Eliza. Her eyes were open. She was watching him, her gaze clear and lucid. "Caleb?" she whispered, her voice weak. He sat up straighter. "The fever's passed. How do you feel?" "Thirsty," she said, "and tired." He brought her a cup of fresh water, helping her sit up to drink. She drank greedily, then sank back onto the pillow. Her eyes scanned his face, taking in the stubble on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. Her gaze fell to his hands, which were resting on the edge of her cot. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing paths down her temples. "What is it?" he asked, alarmed. "Are you in pain?" She shook her head, a single sob escaping her lips. "No one," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "No one has ever touched me like that." He was confused. "Like what?" "Gently," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Just to be kind. My own mother passed when I was a girl, and Arthur, a man's touch was always for taking, not for giving, not for care." Her confession hung in the air between them, raw and profoundly vulnerable. It was an admission of a life so starved of simple tenderness that a basic act of nursing felt like a miracle. Caleb felt as if he'd been kicked in the gut. The full weight of her past suffering settled on him, and he felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it stole his breath. He didn't know what to do, what to say. The emotions churning inside him were a foreign language. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he was afraid his rough hands would only frighten her. He was a man of fences and solitude, of quiet acres and unspoken thoughts. He was not equipped for this, for the raw, open heart of a woman who had been broken and was slowly, tentatively, beginning to heal in his care. He stood up abruptly, the movement clumsy and sudden. He walked over to the fireplace and began to stir the embers with a ferocity that was entirely unnecessary. He couldn't look at her. He could feel her eyes on his back, could feel the weight of her tears, of her gratitude, of a burgeoning connection that terrified him more than any blizzard. The storm inside the cabin had finally broken, and Caleb was left standing in the wreckage, unsure if he had the first idea how to build anything from it. The thaw came as slowly and reluctantly as a man admitting he was wrong. For 2 days after the wind died, the world remained in a state of suspended animation, buried under a thick, soundless blanket of white. Then, a pale, watery sun appeared, and the great melting began. The eaves of the cabin wept. The snow-laden pines shed their burdens in heavy, wet clumps. The world, which had been reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin, began to expand again, revealing a landscape scrubbed clean and glistening. On the 8th day, Caleb judged the drifts had settled enough to risk a trip into Rock Creek. The isolation, once a comfort, had become a charged, humming thing. The air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of his hand on her feverish brow and the echo of her tearful confession. They needed supplies, but more than that, Caleb needed air. He needed the familiar, uncomplicated silence of the trail. He left Eliza with a loaded shotgun and a warning to keep the door barred. Samuel, fully recovered and buzzing with a boy's energy, watched him saddle Gideon with wide, admiring eyes. "Are you coming back?" the boy asked, his voice small. Caleb paused, his hand on the saddle horn. He looked from the boy's worried face to the cabin door, where Eliza stood watching, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'm coming back," he said, the words feeling more like a promise to her than an answer to the boy. Rock Creek was slowly digging itself out. Men were shoveling paths, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The clank of the blacksmith's hammer rang out, a reassuring sound of normalcy. But as Caleb dismounted in front of Abernathy's general store, he felt a change. Conversations didn't stop. Not exactly, but they seemed to falter and shift as he approached. He saw the looks, curious, speculative glances from the men loafing on the porch, and something colder, more appraising, from the women. The news of his guests had clearly survived the storm. Inside, Martha Abernathy, a woman whose sharp nose was matched only by her sharp tongue, gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Caleb, good to see you survived the blizzard. Heard you had company to wait it out with." Her tone was casual, but the question was as pointed as a branding iron. "Found a woman and her boy stranded. Broken wagon," Caleb said, keeping his voice flat, offering no more than the basic facts. He handed her his list. "A widow, they say," Martha pressed on, weighing out a sack of beans. "A young one, too. A real shame, her being all alone like that." The word alone was laced with insinuation. In a town like Rock Creek, a young, unattached woman, especially a pretty one, was a disruption, a stray spark in a town built of dry tinder. He ignored the bait, paid for his supplies, and left. The short walk to the saloon for a bottle of whiskey felt like running a gauntlet. Men nodded to him, but their eyes held a new, knowing glint. They looked at him as if he'd pulled one over on them, as if his solitary nature had just been a ruse all along. The quiet respect he had earned through years of hard work and minding his own business was already beginning to erode, replaced by the grubby currency of gossip. He was tying the supply sacks to his pack horse when a voice called his name. "Caleb, a word, if you please." It was Reverend Miller. He was a tall, severe man with a Bible in one hand and judgment in his eyes. He believed he was shepherding a flock, but often behaved more like a man branding cattle. "Reverend," Caleb acknowledged with a curt nod. "I heard about your act of Christian charity," the Reverend began, his voice smooth but firm. "Taking in the needy is a righteous act. The Lord smiles upon it." He paused, letting the praise settle before delivering the sermon. "But the Lord also warns us to avoid the very appearance of evil. A man of your standing, an unmarried man, living under the same roof as a lone woman. Tongues will wag. My son, it is an unseemly arrangement." Caleb's hands tightened on the leather straps. "She had nowhere else to go. The storm would have killed them." "The storm has passed," Miller said, his gaze unwavering. "But the storm of temptation, of sin, that is a storm that never passes. Her reputation, and more importantly, yours, is at stake. You are a good man, Caleb, a pillar of this community. In your own quiet way, do not let this woman's unfortunate circumstances become the ruin of your good name." "Her name is Eliza," Caleb said, his voice low and cold. "And she is a guest in my home, that's all." "For now," the Reverend said, a look of grim pity on his face. "Pray on it, Caleb. Pray for the strength to do the right thing." He gave a final, solemn nod and walked away, leaving Caleb standing in the muddy street, a cold anger coiling in his stomach. The ride home was quiet, but his mind was loud. He had brought her in to save her from a storm of ice and snow, only to expose her to a storm of whispers and judgment. He had disturbed the quiet order of his life, and now the world was pushing back. When he returned, Eliza was scrubbing the floor, her movements energetic, almost frantic. She looked up as he entered, her face anxious. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Just fine," he lied, setting the sacks on the table. He didn't want to burden her with the town's poison. But she was perceptive. She saw the tightness in his jaw, the way he wouldn't meet her eye. That night, after Samuel was asleep, she approached him as he sat staring into the fire. "They were talking about me in town, weren't they?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I knew this would happen," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I should leave. Samuel and I. We can go now. The main roads should be clear enough. We've been a burden to you for too long. I won't be the cause of your ruin. Caleb." She was offering him an escape, an easy way back to his old life, to the solitude and silence. All he had to do was let her walk away. The thought should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a betrayal. He thought of her walking out into that cold, unforgiving world, with only her courage to protect her from the whispers and the hungry eyes of men. He thought of the Reverend's warning, of Martha Abernathy's sly questions, and the anger he had felt in town hardened into resolve. He turned to look at her. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes wide and haunted. She was braced for his agreement. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a hammer blow. She stared at him, confused. "But your reputation—" "To hell with my reputation," he said, his voice rough. "To hell with the town and their wagging tongues. You're not leaving. Not until you're ready. Not until you have a safe place to go." A tear escaped her eye and traced a silver path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, as if ashamed of the emotion. She didn't thank him. She just gave him a small, trembling nod and retreated to her cot, leaving him alone with the fire and the unsettling realization that he had just made a choice. He had drawn a line in the snow, placing himself on her side, against the world. The days that followed were charged with a new tension. The polite distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by a shared secret, a silent alliance. The nights grew colder still, a deep, penetrating cold that the fire seemed unable to touch. One night, the cold was particularly bitter. Caleb brought in a bottle of the whiskey he'd bought in town. He rarely drank anymore, but the chill had gotten into his bones. He poured 2 fingers into a tin cup for himself and, on an impulse, poured a smaller measure into another cup. He wordlessly handed it to Eliza, who was sitting huddled in a blanket by the hearth. She looked at the cup, then at him, her expression uncertain. "It'll warm you," he said. She took it hesitantly. The first sip made her cough, but a blush of warmth spread through her chest. They drank in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind in the chimney. The whiskey worked its magic, loosening the tight knots of anxiety in their shoulders, softening the sharp edges of the day. Caleb found himself watching her. The firelight caught the red highlights in her dark hair and turned her eyes into pools of deep, liquid shadow. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw and the vulnerability in the curve of her mouth. He saw a woman who had endured the unthinkable and was still, somehow, whole. She must have felt his gaze, because she looked up, and their eyes met, and the world stopped. The air grew thick, heavy, humming with a sudden, powerful current. He could hear the frantic beat of his own heart, a frantic drum against the silence. Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching in her throat. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but a mirror of the same shocked hunger that was clawing its way up his own throat. It was a hunger that had been starved for years, a deep, aching loneliness he hadn't even allowed himself to name. He didn't know who moved first. It was as if the space between them simply collapsed. One moment, he was by the fire. The next, he was kneeling in front of her, his hands coming up to cup her face. Her skin was soft, a startling contrast to his own calloused palms. He could feel the tremor that ran through her. He hesitated for a heartbeat, giving her a chance to pull away, to say no. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, searching thing, born of cold nights and lonely years, of unspoken sympathy and simmering desire. It was the taste of whiskey and wood smoke and sorrow. He felt her hands come up to grip his arms, her fingers digging into his worn shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, and a groan escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated need. This was madness. The Reverend's warnings echoed in his mind. This was ruin. But as her body melted against his, as she answered his desperate hunger with her own, he knew he didn't care. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the dull ache of existence. He felt alive. He lifted her in his arms. She was impossibly light, and carried her the few steps to the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. He laid her down gently, the firelight painting her in hues of orange and gold. What followed was not the brutal, selfish taking she had known. It was an exploration, a rediscovery. For Caleb, it was a fumbling attempt at reverence, his rough hands trying to learn a new language of tenderness. For Eliza, it was a terrifying, breathtaking surrender to a touch that sought to give rather than take. It was a frantic, passionate collision of two lonely souls, a desperate search for warmth in the heart of a long winter, a silent, shouted confession that they were not made of stone. The morning came with the cold, gray light of regret. Caleb woke first. The warmth of Eliza's body still curled against his side. For a moment, a feeling of deep, profound peace settled over him. But then he saw the look on her face. She was awake, had been for some time, and she was staring at the ceiling with eyes that were hollow and filled with a familiar, heartbreaking shame. She felt him stir and immediately pulled away, gathering her clothes and dressing with her back to him, her movements stiff and hurried. "Eliza," he started, his voice thick with sleep. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. She wouldn't look at him. "Please, just don't." She fled into the bedroom where Samuel was still sleeping, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Caleb lay on the rug, the warmth of the night turning to ash. He had thought they had found something beautiful in the darkness, but the daylight had revealed it to be, in her eyes, just another sin. He dressed and went about his chores, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. When she finally emerged, her face was pale and scrubbed, her eyes red-rimmed. She moved around the cabin like a ghost, avoiding his gaze, her every movement an apology. He couldn't stand it. He cornered her by the water pump, forcing her to look at him. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "What's wrong?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I am what's wrong. Caleb, I let you. I let myself. I am what they say I am. A ruined woman. Her voice broke. "A harlot who trades her body for a roof over her head." The word struck him with physical force. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice low and intense. "You know that's not what happened." "It doesn't matter what I know," she cried, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "It's what the world knows. It's what I am. Arthur, he told me every day what I was, that my body was my only currency, that I was worthless, and last night I proved him right." He saw then the true depth of her wounds. Her husband had not just beaten her body, he had systematically destroyed her spirit, convincing her that she was unworthy of love, unworthy of tenderness, worthy only of being used. And Caleb, in his clumsy attempt to show her passion, had only managed to reinforce her deepest held fears about herself. The pain he felt was not for himself, but for her. For the beautiful, courageous woman who saw herself as something soiled and broken. "You're wrong, Eliza," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't name. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around her waist as if to hold herself together. "You don't understand. It's not just about what people say. I'm not just running from gossip. I'm running from him, from Arthur's family." Caleb stared at her. confused. "But he's dead."
"He is," she said,
her voice dropping to a terrified whisper.
"But his brother isn't. Jacob Mayhew. Arthur owed him money, a great deal of it. When Arthur died, Jacob said the debt remained. He said that Samuel was now his concern, that he had a right to him. He doesn't want a son. Caleb, he wants an asset, a boy to work his farm for free until he's a man. He sees Samuel as property, a way to settle a debt. That's why we were going to Montana, to disappear. The men who robbed us, I think Jacob sent them, to scare us, to take what little we had so we'd have no choice but to go back."
The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was not just a woman seeking refuge from a storm. This was a mother fighting for her child's freedom, running from a monster who wore the guise of family. The trouble he had feared from the very beginning was here. It had a name, and it was coming for her. And he, by his own choice, was standing right in the middle of its path. The news arrived like a fox in a henhouse, carried on the wind of gossip from town. Caleb had gone in for salt, leaving Eliza and Samuel in the now familiar safety of the ranch. He returned near dusk, his face set like granite, the silence around him colder and harder than usual. He didn't speak until after Samuel was asleep, tucked away in the small bedroom that had become his own. Eliza was darning one of Caleb's socks by the fire, the simple domestic act a small anchor in her turbulent world. She watched him, knowing something was wrong. He had been pacing the cabin for an hour, a caged wolf, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "He's here," Caleb said finally, his back to her as he stared into the flames. Eliza's needle froze, a cold dread, sharp and sickening, pierced through her. She didn't have to ask who he was. "In Rock Creek," she whispered. "At the saloon," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Calls himself Jacob Mayhew. He's showing some papers around, telling anyone who'll listen that he's come to claim his kin." The way he spat the word kin made it sound like a curse. "He says the law's on his side, that he's here to take Samuel back to a proper Christian home." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. It was happening. The nightmare she had run from for months had found her. It had followed her into this one safe place and was now threatening to burn it to the ground.
What did you do?"
"I had a word with him," Caleb said, and he turned then. The look in his eyes was something she had never seen before, a cold, controlled fury that was more frightening than any loud rage she had ever witnessed. The scene in the saloon had been taut as a hangman's rope. Caleb had walked in, the bat-wing doors swinging shut behind him, and the low hum of conversation had dwindled to a murmur. Jacob Mayhew was holding court at the bar, a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that darted about, assessing his audience. He was dressed in a suit that was too fine for Rock Creek. A gold watch chain stretched across his ample stomach. A stack of official-looking documents lay on the bar next to his whiskey glass. "And the boy," he was saying, his voice unctuous and loud. "He needs a firm hand, a man's guidance. His mother, God rest her, is a delicate creature, overwrought, not fit to raise a boy alone in this wild country." Caleb walked straight to the bar and stood beside him. He didn't speak, just ordered a whiskey. The proximity, the sheer, solid presence of him, made Jacob Mayhew falter. He turned, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Can I help you, friend?" Jacob asked. "You're Jacob Mayhew," Caleb stated. It wasn't a question. A smug smile spread across Jacob's face. "I am, and you must be the fellow who's been sheltering my poor, lost sister-in-law. Caleb, is it? The town seems to hold you in some regard. I'm in your debt for your kindness." The word kindness was heavy with insinuation. "She's not your sister-in-law," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying through the now silent saloon. "And the boy isn't yours." Jacob's smile tightened. He tapped a fat finger on the papers. "The law says otherwise. I have guardianship papers, signed and sealed. Arthur, my late brother, left his affairs in a tangle. Debts to be settled. The boy is part of that settlement. He is family property." "A boy is not a horse to be traded for a debt," Caleb said, turning to face him fully. Caleb was taller, leaner, his body hardened by labor, not softened by excess. He looked at Jacob with a flat, deadly calm. "You're not taking him." Jacob puffed out his chest. "I have the law on my side. What do you have? A lonely ranch and a misplaced sense of chivalry? I'll have the sheriff ride out with me tomorrow. You interfere, and you'll be obstructing justice. You want to see the inside of a cell over a woman you barely know?" "You'll not set foot on my land," Caleb said. His hand was nowhere near his gun, yet the threat was unmistakable. It was in the set of his shoulders, in the ice of his blue eyes. "And if you try, the sheriff will be riding back alone." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Jacob's bluster seemed to shrink under the weight of Caleb's unwavering intensity. He was a man used to bullying with words and paper, not with the raw, unspoken promise of violence. He finally broke eye contact, turning back to his drink with a shaky hand. "We'll see what the sheriff has to say about that," he muttered, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. Caleb downed his whiskey in one swallow, slapped a coin on the bar, and walked out without another word. Now, back in the cabin, the aftermath of that confrontation hung heavy in the air. Eliza was on her feet, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. "You shouldn't have done that, Caleb. You can't fight him. He has the law." "The law?" Caleb scoffed. "That ain't law. That's paper. It's a piece of paper he's using to steal a child."
"But he'll bring trouble to you. He'll bring the sheriff. He could hurt you."
The thought brought a fresh wave of panic. She saw it all playing out. Caleb, this quiet, decent man, being thrown in jail or worse, all because he had taken her in.
"It's my fault. All of it. I should have kept running."
She sank onto a chair, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing her. Caleb stood watching her, his anger at Jacob warring with a powerful, unfamiliar emotion. He saw her not as a burden, not as trouble, but as a woman of incredible strength, finally broken by a world that had been relentlessly cruel to her. He saw her fierce, desperate love for her brother, a love that had driven her across the country, a love that now made her willing to sacrifice her own happiness to protect him. And in that moment, watching her weep in the firelight, the final wall around his heart crumbled into dust. It wasn't pity he felt, it wasn't duty, it was a fierce, possessive, and terrifyingly tender feeling. It was the absolute certainty that her pain was his pain, that her safety was more important than his own solitude, more important than his own life. He had spent 10 years building a fortress to keep the world out, and in a matter of weeks, this woman had not only breached the walls, she had captured the keep. He loved her. The realization was not a gentle dawn, but a lightning strike, illuminating everything with a stark, undeniable clarity. He crossed the room and knelt before her, gently pulling her hands away from her face. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. "Listen to me," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "This is not your fault. This is his fault. We will face him. Together." That night, there was no question of sleeping apart. The cabin felt too large, the darkness outside too menacing. After she had cried herself out, he led her to the bearskin rug before the fire, the place where their desire had first ignited. But this time was different. There was no whiskey-fueled desperation, no frantic collision of lonely bodies. This was something else entirely. He lay down beside her and simply held her, stroking her hair as her trembling slowly subsided. He told her about the war, about things he had never spoken of to another living soul, about the fear and the cold and the bone-deep weariness of seeing too much death. He spoke of the guilt of surviving when so many others hadn't, and how he had come west seeking a place so empty he might forget. And she, in turn, whispered her own truths into the darkness. She spoke not of the beatings, but of the small humiliations Arthur had inflicted, the way he had chipped away at her soul, piece by piece. She told him of her dreams of a small house with a garden, a place where Samuel could grow up without fear, a life so simple it seemed like an impossible fantasy. Their words were a balm, a quiet confession of shared wounds. When he finally kissed her, it was with a reverence that made her want to weep all over again. His touch was not a demand, but a question. His hands, usually so capable and rough, were now impossibly gentle as they moved over her, as if relearning her skin, trying to erase the memory of every harsh touch she had ever known. It was a slow, tender act of healing. It was the gentle pressure of his lips on the faded scar above her eyebrow. It was the way she traced the lines of his face in the firelight, her fingers memorizing the map of his life. It was a quiet exchange of solace, a profound and deeply spiritual binding of two fractured souls. It was not the slaking of a long-denied thirst, but the sharing of a single cup of water in the desert, in the warmth of the fire, surrounded by the vast, cold emptiness of the plains. They found a sanctuary in each other. It was a connection that went deeper than passion, a quiet, sacred promise made not in words, but in the language of touch, of tears, of shared breath in the darkness. Caleb woke before dawn, Eliza's head resting on his chest, her breathing soft and even. The clarity of the night before had not faded in the light of day. It had solidified into a hard, unwavering resolve. He knew what he had to do. It was the only thing to do. It was practical. It was logical. And it was the only way he could think of to give a name to the fierce, protective love he felt for her. He waited until she was awake, until they had shared a cup of coffee in the quiet morning air. Samuel was outside, happily building a snow fort, his laughter a bright, cheerful sound against the silence. "I'm going to marry you," Caleb said. He said it simply, a statement of fact, as if he were announcing his intention to mend a fence. Eliza, who had been sipping her coffee, froze. She slowly lowered the cup, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What?" "It's the only way," he explained, his voice even and matter-of-fact. "Mayhew has his papers. He has a claim. However rotten, the sheriff, the law, they'll see a blood relation against a stranger. But if I'm your husband, I'm Samuel's stepfather. I have a legal right, a husband's right to protect his family. It gives us a foundation to fight him. It's the only way to keep you both safe. Permanently." He watched her, expecting relief, maybe even gratitude. He had offered her the ultimate protection, his name, his home, his life. But he did not see relief in her eyes. He saw a flicker of hope, so quickly extinguished by a wave of profound sadness that it broke his heart. She shook her head slowly, a look of anguish on her face. "No," she whispered. The word was a physical blow. "No? What do you mean? No? Did you not hear what I said? It's the only way to stop him."
"I hear you,"
she said, her voice trembling.
"I hear you offering to ruin your life for us, to tie yourself to a woman with a ruined name and a world of trouble,
To sacrifice everything you've built here out of a sense of duty." "This isn't about duty," he said, his voice rising in frustration.
"Isn't it?"
she countered, and now there were tears in her eyes. "You are a good man, Caleb, the best I have ever known. You see people in trouble, and you help them. You took us in from the storm. You cared for me when I was sick. You stood up to that monster in town, and now you see this as just one more thing you have to do to fix the problem. But I cannot let you do it. I cannot let you chain yourself to me out of pity." He was stunned into silence. Pity? Duty? Was that what she thought this was? After last night? He didn't have the words to explain what he felt. Words like love were foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He had tried to show her with his actions, with his body, with this final, ultimate act of commitment. and she had thrown it back in his face, labeling it with the one thing it was not. "You think this is pity?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, the hurt turning to anger.
"What else could it be?"
she cried, her own pain making her blind to his. "You're a solitary man. You value your peace, your good name. I bring nothing but chaos and whispers and danger. Marrying me is not a choice you would make for yourself. It is a sacrifice, and I am not worth that sacrifice." Her belief in her own worthlessness was a wall between them he did not know how to break down. He had offered her his name, and she had told him she wasn't worthy of it. The rejection was absolute. A cold fury washed over him, at her, at himself for his inability to make her understand, at the world that had so thoroughly convinced her she was nothing. "Fine," he bit out, the word sharp as a shard of ice. He stood up, grabbing his coat from its peg. "If that's what you think, then there's nothing more to say." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He strode to the door, pulled it open, and walked out into the biting cold, slamming it shut behind him. The sound echoed in the cabin, a final, jarring note of discord. Eliza was left alone, surrounded by the sudden, deafening silence. She sank into her chair, a single sob escaping her lips. She had done the right thing, the only thing she could do. She had saved him from herself. So why did it feel as though she had just ripped her own heart out? Caleb's anger was a cold, slow-burning fire. He spent the day after their argument working himself to the point of exhaustion, splitting logs with a savage rhythm, the sharp crack of the axe the only outlet for the storm of frustration and hurt inside him. He had offered her everything he was, and she had seen only a transaction of pity. He didn't understand that her refusal was born not of a lack of love, but of a surplus of shame. She watched him from the cabin window, her heart aching with every swing of the axe, trapped in a misery of her own making. The fragile peace, however painful, was shattered 2 days later. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary expression suggested he'd seen too much of human folly, rode out to the ranch. He didn't come alone. Trailing behind him, looking smug and triumphant, was Jacob Mayhew. "Caleb," Sheriff Brody said, tipping his hat with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "Got a formal complaint here from Mr. Mayhew. He's accusing this woman, Eliza, of abducting the boy, Samuel." "That's the most damn fool thing I've ever heard," Caleb growled, stepping in front of the cabin door as if to shield it with his own body. "Be that as it may," the sheriff sighed. "He's filed it proper. Judge Thatcher is holding a circuit hearing at the town hall tomorrow morning. He wants you and the woman there, and the boy." He looked pointedly at Jacob. "And he's ordered that Mr. Mayhew here is not to set foot on your property until the matter is settled." Jacob's face soured, but he held his tongue. He had found a bigger, more powerful weapon than threats in a saloon. He had enlisted the full, blind weight of the law. The news devastated Eliza. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen. "He's done it," she whispered after they'd gone, her eyes wide with terror. "He'll twist everything. He'll tell them I'm an unfit mother, a seductress, anything he can to take Samuel. And they'll believe him. They already believe me to be a fallen woman." Caleb's anger had vanished, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. The time for arguments and hurt feelings was over. "Let them believe what they want," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of fear. "Tomorrow, we'll tell them the truth." The town hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, drafty wooden hall used for meetings, socials, and now for dispensing frontier justice. Nearly the entire town of Rock Creek was present, their face a sea of grim curiosity. They packed the wooden benches, the men in their worn work clothes, the women in their Sunday best, as if attending a somber church service. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, sawdust, and sanctimonious judgment. Eliza sat on a hard bench at the front, with Caleb beside her. Samuel was between them. clutching her hand, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. Eliza felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her back. She could hear the whispers, the rustle of fabric as heads turned to get a better look at the scarlet widow who had bewitched the town recluse. She kept her eyes fixed on her lap, her posture rigid, a lone ship in a hostile sea. At the front of the hall, Judge Thatcher sat behind a sturdy oak table. He was a balding, portly man with a walrus mustache and tired eyes that had seen every kind of human desperation and greed. He valued order above all else. Jacob Mayhew sat at a separate table, looking the part of the aggrieved, respectable uncle. He presented his case with a smooth, practiced ease, his voice filled with false sorrow. He spoke of his dear departed brother, of his concern for his nephew's welfare. He produced his legal papers, waving them for all to see. The boy, Samuel, is heir to a small piece of property back east. Jacob explained, his tone reasonable. These papers grant me stewardship of that property and of the boy's welfare until he comes of age. It is my solemn duty to my family to see him raised properly, with a moral compass. He then turned his gaze on Eliza, and his voice dripped with pity. Eliza, my sister-in-law, has been through a terrible ordeal. Her grief, I fear, has unhinged her. She has been wandering the country, dragging this poor child with her. She has fallen in with Mr. Caleb here. The crowd murmured. Reverend Miller, sitting in the front row, nodded gravely. I mean no disrespect to Mr. Caleb. Jacob continued smoothly. He is, by all accounts, a hard-working man, but the arrangement is, you must admit, highly irregular. A young widow and an unmarried man, living in isolation. It is not a wholesome environment for a boy. I am simply here to do what is right, to take Samuel back to a stable, God-fearing home. He sat down to a low hum of approval. Judge Thatcher looked at Eliza. Ma'am, do you have anything to say to this? Eliza stood, her knees trembling. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. All she could see were the condemning faces, the cold eyes of her neighbors. She saw Martha Abernathy whisper something to the woman beside her, who then glanced at Eliza with open disdain. Her courage failed her. She shook her head and sank back down, a wave of shame washing over her. I see, the judge said, his expression grim. It was going just as Jacob had planned. I have something to say. The voice cut through the hall, clear and steady. Every head turned. Caleb was on his feet. He was not a man for public speaking. His hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white, but he stood tall, his gaze fixed on the judge. Call him as a witness, Judge Thatcher grunted. Caleb walked to the front of the room and stood before the table. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the judge, and then he looked at Eliza. State your name for the record. Caleb. Just Caleb? It's the only name I use. Very well, Caleb. Tell us what you know of this matter. Caleb took a breath. I was riding home ahead of the blizzard. 5 miles from my ranch, I found a wrecked wagon. Inside were Eliza and the boy. They were half frozen and starving. Their horse was gone, their supplies stolen. They had been attacked and left for dead. He paused, letting the simple, stark facts settle. I took them in because leaving them would have been murder. The blizzard trapped us for more than a week. She was sick, a fever so bad I thought she might die. I nursed her. We survived. That is what happened. And she has remained with you since? The judge asked. Yes. Caleb's jaw tightened. She cooks and cleans and mends. She is a good woman. She is a good mother. She is not unhinged. She is afraid. Jacob Mayhew stood up. Afraid of what? I asked. Of being rescued? Of her own family? Caleb turned his head and pinned Jacob with an icy glare. She's afraid of you, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. She told me about her husband. Your brother. She told me how he beat her, how he treated her like property. And she told me that you see his son the same way. Not as a nephew to be loved, but as a debt to be collected, a free hand to work your farm. A gasp went through the crowd. This was more than just an improper living arrangement. This was an accusation of monstrous cruelty.
"These are the ravings of a hysterical woman,"
Jacob sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "She has clearly poisoned this man's mind with her womanly wiles." "Is that what you call it?" Caleb shot back, his voice rising with a passion no one in that room had ever heard from him. "I call it the truth. I have lived a quiet life here for 10 years. I have bothered no one. My reputation, my good name, it was all I had. And I am willing to stand here today, in front of all of you, and throw it in the mud. I am willing to be the subject of your gossip and your judgment for the rest of my days, because I will not stand by and watch this man steal a child from his mother. I will not let you send them back to the hell they ran from." He was breathing hard, his declaration hanging in the shocked silence of the hall. He had laid his soul bare for them, for her. He had publicly sacrificed the one thing he held most dear, his privacy, to defend her. And it was too much for Eliza to bear. A choked sob escaped her lips. She shot to her feet, her face a mess of tears, and ran the few steps to Caleb's side. She didn't just take his arm. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, clinging to him as if he were the last solid thing on earth.
"It's true,"
she cried, her voice muffled against his shirt.
"All of it is true. My husband was a monster. He hurt me. He told me I was worthless, that I deserved it. And Jacob is just like him. He doesn't care about Samuel. He just wants to own him. I was so scared to say anything. I was afraid no one would believe me. I was ashamed."
She looked up at Caleb, her eyes pleading. "And I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong. I was just so afraid of ruining you, the only good man I have ever known." The raw, unvarnished pain in her voice did what no calm testimony could have. It shattered the room's smug certainty. This was not the performance of a cunning seductress. This was the desperate cry of a wounded heart. Just then, another voice, clear and strong, rose from the back of the hall. "She's telling the truth about the Mayhew men." All eyes turned. Agnes Cartwright, the blacksmith's elderly widow, was on her feet. She was a woman respected for her sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude. Even Reverend Miller held his tongue when Agnes spoke. "My cousin lived in the same town as the Mayhews back in Pennsylvania," Agnes announced, her gaze sweeping the room. "I heard the stories for years. Arthur Mayhew was a violent drunk who put his own father in the hospital, and Jacob here was known as a man who'd foreclose on his own mother if it meant an extra $1. They are cut from a cruel cloth, the both of them. What this young woman says, it has the ring of truth." Agnes's testimony was a thunderclap. It was one thing to dismiss the words of an outsider and a compromised man. It was another thing entirely to dismiss Agnes Cartwright. The tide of public opinion, so swift to condemn, began to turn. The whispers changed from accusation to sympathy. Jacob Mayhew stood alone, his face pale, his legal papers looking flimsy and false. Judge Thatcher banged his gavel on the table. "Order! Order!" He looked from Jacob's sputtering face to Eliza, who was still clinging to Caleb. He took in the murmuring crowd and the stern, set face of Agnes Cartwright. He was a man of law, but he was also a man of politics, and he knew a losing fight when he saw one. "This court finds no evidence of abduction," he declared, his voice booming through the hall. "Mrs. Eliza Mayhew's guardianship of her brother, Samuel, is affirmed. Mr. Mayhew, your claim is dismissed. I suggest you be on the next stage out of this territory." A wave of relief so powerful it made Eliza's knees buckle washed over her. Caleb held her steady, his arm a band of iron around her. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked at Eliza, his expression hardening. "However, this situation has caused a significant disruption to the peace and good order of this community. The testimony has been inflammatory. Therefore, this court also orders that you, Mrs. Mayhew, and the boy are to vacate Rock Creek and its surrounding lands within 10 days' time. The air went out of the room. They had won, but they had also lost. "Judge, that's not fair," Caleb started, but the judge cut him off with a sharp look. "My ruling is final. It is the only way to restore harmony. This hearing is adjourned." He banged his gavel again, and it was over. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with the verdict. Eliza was free, Samuel was safe, but she was being cast out, exiled. Caleb stood there, his arm still around her, the noise of the hall fading into a dull roar in his ears. He looked down at Eliza's tear-streaked face. He had won her freedom, but the law was sending her away. He looked around at the ranch he had spent 10 years building, the quiet life he had fought to create. It was his. It was safe. He could stay here, and in 10 days, his life would go back to the way it was, silent, orderly, and empty. Or he could turn his back on all of it. He could pack his horse, abandon his land, and follow her into the unknown. The choice was brutally simple: his land, or his heart, his solitude, or the woman who had shattered it and somehow made him whole. He stood in the middle of the crowded town hall, completely and utterly alone with the most important decision of his life. The 10 days granted by the judge were a peculiar kind of prison. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage with a rapidly approaching expiration date. Every sunrise was a reminder of a coming sunset that would be her last on this small patch of earth that had, against all odds, started to feel like home. Eliza spent the days in a flurry of melancholic activity. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone. She mended every last tear in Samuel's clothes and even patched the worn elbows on Caleb's coat, her needle moving with a sad, rhythmic precision. She was preparing to leave the place in better condition than she had found it, a small, inadequate payment for the life that had been saved within its walls. Caleb was a ghost. He was there, but he was not. He had retreated back into the impenetrable fortress of his silence, the warmth and passion from the town hall seemingly extinguished by her rejection of his proposal. He did his chores with a grim, mechanical efficiency, his face a mask of stone. They moved around each other like strangers, the air between them thick with unspoken pain, with words of love and fear that had been spoken too late or not at all. Eliza's heart ached with the knowledge that she had inflicted this wound. She had tried to save him from herself, and in doing so, had severed the very connection that had kept her afloat. Samuel, blissfully unaware of the adult complexities swirling around him, was simply sad to be leaving. He followed Caleb to the barn, chattering about the cows, and asked if Gideon, the horse, would miss him. Caleb would answer in monosyllables, his gaze distant, his hands never ceasing their work. On the 9th night, her last night, the weight of it all became unbearable. Samuel was asleep, his peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own chest. The cabin was tidy, their meager belongings packed into a single canvas sack by the door. There was nothing left to do but wait for the morning and the long, lonely road ahead. She stood by the window, looking out at the moon-drenched landscape. The snow glittered under a sea of stars, vast and indifferent. This land was harsh and unforgiving, but here, in this small cabin, she had found a kindness she had never known. She had felt safe. She had felt seen. She looked at the bearskin rug before the hearth, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her. She had known passion there, and later, a tenderness so profound it had felt like a holy sacrament. And she was going to walk away from it, because she loved the man who had offered it to her too much to destroy him. Her packing was complete. It hadn't taken long. A spare dress, Samuel's mended shirts, the small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. As she folded her last item, a small shawl Caleb had bought for her in town. Her tears began to fall. They dripped onto the worn wool, dark spots of sorrow. She was leaving the only home she'd felt in years, and the only man she had ever truly loved. She heard the sound of hoofbeats, and her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Jacob Mayhew returned to gloat? Had the sheriff come to escort her out early? She ran to the door, her hand trembling as she lifted the bar. It was Caleb. He was just riding in from the darkness, but he was not alone. He was leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare, fully saddled and packed with supplies, bedrolls, a sack of flour, canteens, a rifle in a scabbard. It was a mirror image of his own pack horse. He dismounted and walked towards her, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped a few feet away, his face cast in the silver moonlight. The cold mask was gone. In its place was a look of raw, unwavering resolve. In his hand, he held a worn, folded map. "The judge said you had to leave," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the frigid air. "He didn't say you had to leave alone." Eliza stared at him, at the second horse, at the map in his hand. Her mind couldn't seem to make sense of what she was seeing. "Caleb, what are you doing?" He took a step closer, his eyes holding hers. After you turned me down, I was angry and I was hurt. I spent days trying to understand. I thought you didn't feel what I felt, but then I stood in that hall and watched you, and I realized you weren't turning me down. You were turning down what you thought was a bad bargain. You were trying to protect me, even when it was tearing you apart. He took another step, closing the space between them. I've lived my whole life believing that the safest way to live was alone, that fences and silence were the only things that could keep the pain out. You walked through those fences like they were smoke. You filled the silence, and leaving you now, sending you out there alone, that's a bigger pain than any I've ever known. He gently took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. I told you once I couldn't let you stay in a storm, and there are other storms than snow. Eliza, there's the storm of loneliness, and the storm of starting over, and the storm of a world that isn't always kind. I can't let you go into that storm alone. Tears were streaming down her face now, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of disbelief, of a joy so overwhelming it was painful. "But your ranch," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Your home, everything you've built." "It's just wood and dirt," he said with a small shrug. "It was a place to hide. It's not a home, not anymore. A home is not a place you are. It's a person you're with." He lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her palm. "I love you, Eliza. Words like that don't come easy to me. They might not ever, but my life, it started the day I found you in that broken wagon, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let it end the day you ride away." She couldn't speak. She could only throw her arms around his neck and hold on, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke, leather, and him. He held her just as tightly, his arms a circle of strength and certainty around her. The argument, the pain, the misunderstanding, it all melted away in the cold moonlight, leaving only the pure, unvarnished truth of their connection. They left in the gray mist of pre-dawn. The lights of Rock Creek were not yet lit. The town that had judged her and then cast her out was a sleeping, silent beast at their backs. Caleb lifted Samuel, still half asleep, onto the mare, bundling him in warm blankets. He then helped Eliza mount, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. He swung up onto Gideon, took the mare's lead rope, and without a backward glance, nudged his horse forward. They rode east, away from the jagged mountains, toward the rising sun, a pale, promising smudge of pink on the horizon. As the light grew, illuminating the vast, rolling plains before them, Eliza reached out, and Caleb took her gloved hand in his. They rode like that for a mile, their hands clasped between them, a silent testament to their new, shared journey. Behind them, the ranch he had built with his own 2 hands grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a dark speck on the endless white canvas. And then it was gone. He had left his past behind. Ahead lay only the horizon, a blank page on which they would write a new story. They rode all day, speaking little, content in the quiet companionship. As evening approached, the sky turning a brilliant, bruised purple, Caleb led them off the trail and into a small grove of ancient cottonwoods. In the center of the grove stood one magnificent, gnarled giant of a tree, its branches spreading like protective arms over a sheltered clearing. "We'll make camp here," he said. It was a different kind of work than the frantic, necessary chores of the blizzard. This was calm, deliberate, the first act of building their new life together. They worked as a team, unsaddling the horses, rubbing them down. Samuel, now wide awake and excited by the adventure, gathered twigs for kindling. Caleb built the fire, and as the flames leaped to life, chasing away the deep blue shadows of twilight, Eliza prepared a simple meal of bacon and coffee. They ate sitting close together by the fire, sharing a single plate, the warmth of the flames on their faces. The silence was not empty or tense. It was full and peaceful. It was the silence of belonging. Above them, the stars began to appear, impossibly bright in the clear, cold air. The world felt vast and new, and for the first time, Eliza did not feel small and lost within it. She felt anchored. After Samuel had fallen asleep, wrapped snugly in his bedroll, Caleb pulled his own blankets next to Eliza's, so close that their shoulders touched. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. They weren't hiding from a storm. They weren't seeking a moment's frantic solace from pain or fear. This was not about sin or shame or what the world might think. This was simply two people, under a canopy of a million stars, holding each other by the light of a fire they had built together. There was no desperation, no regret. There was only the quiet, powerful certainty of a shared future. It was a moment of profound peace, filled with a simmering passion that was now intertwined with hope. She tilted her head back to look at him. The firelight carved his face in lines of shadow and gold, and in his eyes she saw a love so deep and steady it took her breath away. He was not just a man who had saved her. He was the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and had chosen her, not in spite of her broken pieces, but because of the strength it took to hold them together. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of coffee and wood smoke and forever. It was a promise, a homecoming, a beginning. She pulled back just enough to whisper, her voice soft against the crackle of the flames, a final truth dawning in her heart. "You know," she murmured, a small smile playing on her lips as she traced the line of his jaw. "I thought that blizzard was the biggest storm I would ever see." She looked deep into his eyes, her heart overflowing. "But I was wrong. The greatest storm of my life was you." Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed our time together around the campfire, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and sharing your thoughts on the story.